today we're here to talk about conscious leadership. And before I get into what exactly conscious leadership is, in case you don't know, I want to set a little bit of intention. I really believe in the power of intention. It's important when we set intentions, we need to understand before we get started on a journey, where are we going? And one of the things that I love about this talk is curiosity is required for learning, and courage is required for unlearning. So today in the talk, there are going to be some new things that you learn. So there's going to be some curiosity. So we want to set the intention for curiosity. There's also going to be some courage that's required because you're going to be doing some unlearning. We can't get into consciousness and awakening and awareness and all of the JEDI, justice, equity, diversity, and inclusion topics without knowing there are things to learn and there are also things for us to unlearn. So as we get started, one of my favorite ways to get ready to go on a journey is to invite each of you, as you're listening, to just go ahead and reach down and take your shoes off. And if you're wondering, why am I asking you to take your shoes off? I want you to know that we're all on level playing field. So I would love for us to all have our bare feet. So as I'm asking you to take your shoes off, I'm taking my shoes off. I kind of feel like Mr. Rogers' Neighborhood as I take my shoes off and I'm holding them up. And so I want you to take your shoes off so that you have the ability to know that we all stand on the same common ground, and that common ground is our shared humanity. That's the intention I would like to set for our talk today, as well as the curiosity and the courage that it requires to go into this topic. And on the screen, as you can see with the slides, there's a boat on the crystal clear blue water. And so now with our bare feet, I want us to just close our eyes for just a moment. And I want you to imagine that you are walking on cool sand on a beach, walking towards this little boat in this crystal clear blue water. And as you step into the warm, crystal clear blue water, you walk up to the boat and you step in. And as you get in this boat, there are two oars. And with just a peaceful, grateful, and curious and courageous heart, you start paddling out into the crystal clear blue sea. And this is the energy and intention as we go into the unknown that we're going to work with together over the next few moments discussing this incredible topic of conscious leadership. And so I'd like to invite you to go ahead and open your eyes as you're in this boat on this wonderful, calm sea. And now I'd like to begin to share with you what is conscious leadership. And so what I have is an equation that explains conscious leadership. And there are going to be three things you're going to leave with today. And if all you remember is this equation and the next two acronyms that I teach, that's all you need to be able to implement all of what we're going to talk about. So this first equation is C equals A to the third power. You might be thinking, what does math have to do with leadership? Well, C stands for consciousness. And the three A's are awakening, awareness, and availability. And so consciousness in and of itself means that you are awake. That's what consciousness is. And you cannot lead, in my opinion, unless you are truly awake. So a lot of times people ask me, what is it exactly that you do? And if I were to take that beautiful highlight reel of the bio and all the awesome things, it actually could be drilled down into one sentence. And I tell people, I help people wake up. And so as a conscious leader, in order to be awake, you first must experience awakening. And unfortunately, for many of us, awakening comes a lot of times in the form of suffering and breakdowns. And we're going to talk a little bit more about that as we go further in. Once the breakdown occurs, what happens is the breakthrough then begins to allow us to cultivate awareness. And awareness, I actually share awareness as, just imagine just kind of pulling the curtains open a little bit more on the window of your life and being able to allow more light in and to see more. So once we have our awakening, we then begin to become more aware. Once we are in that awareness place, all that information that's coming into us as leaders allows us to then be available to, as I stated, learn or unlearn, or maybe do both as we begin to grow and cultivate our own leadership. So conscious leadership is a relatively new term in this world of leadership development. It's really quite simple. I love this image on the slide. It's a chalkboard with all kinds of drawings and information. It doesn't have to be that difficult. It's a simple equation. If you can just remember C equals A to the third power. My conscious leadership requires that I have awakening, I have awareness, and I have availability. Many times as leaders, when we bump into the hard stuff or we bump into hard situations, a lot of us will turn around and want to run back and cling back to what feels good. It's the actual breakdowns and the hard conversations with ourselves and with others that allows us to become aware and draw those curtains back, if you will, in your mind so you can see more than what you're currently seeing. And in that seeing, as we get into our JEDI part of our talk, unconscious bias is also a term we're hearing a lot about in the leadership development world and in our community at large. And unconscious bias simply means I don't see something. So wouldn't it be great if we could cultivate the awareness to pull those curtains back and actually learn to see more than just what we see in our own limited awareness? And then, as I mentioned again, then that gives us the availability to show up differently, to show up with a wholehearted sense of self, to serve something greater than ourselves. So our first takeaway is C equals A to the third power. And how that actually comes about. So for me in my bio, and a lot of people that know me that work with me understand, I teach from an integrative development point of view. I thought this would be really helpful to share with everyone what that integrative development is and why it's important in that equation of getting people to awaken and then cultivate awareness and then teach the availability of more options that they have available as leaders. And in integrative development, we do a couple of things. As practitioners, we hold space and we actually work with the whole person. And so there's an image here that actually shows we work with the spiritual, with the professional, with the social, the personal, the contextual. And in the middle of that holistic aspect of a person is this moment. And so I talk a lot about with my clients that the real client here is the moment. It's not me, it's not you as a leader, it's not your employees, it's not anyone actually. The client in integrative development and in conscious leadership is the moment. What does this moment most want and need from me right here, right now? So when we can step into the middle of this whole holistic approach, this whole person as a leader, we actually can step into key moments where we can become more aware. And it's critical in order to become awakened, aware, and available to actually work with your whole self, not just parts of yourself. And another aspect of integrative development is we work on creating experiences, not explanations. And so today in this talk, you're going to have multiple experiences, not just explanations of text and content that I'm going to share with you. So we'll do some more reflective exercises at the end. And then lastly, the most important thing about integrative development is helping clients to see multiple perspectives. And with that, as leaders, you take in a lot of information. And with that approach, I love this next slide. I actually have the different perspectives that we integrate as integrative development practitioners. I have these really cool glasses, and they're actually, you can order them on Amazon. They show things in a kaleidoscope fashion. And when I say things are all screwed up, I say they're all fractaled up. They're all these fractals of particles of lights and position. And I've worn these a few times on my podcast, and sometimes I even pull them out with clients and actually put these glasses on and say, can you look through this lens and tell me what you see now? Because when you look through this kaleidoscope lens, what happens is you see millions of parts of pieces. You don't just look through regular glasses and see one particular image. So it's important for us to remember as leaders, we're dealing with time, we're dealing with space, we're dealing with big picture, small detail, the size of things. As leaders, we're dealing with our focus. Is it on presence? Is it on absence? Is it on the past? Is it on the present, the future? We're also dealing with characters that are involved in our work and in our life, and they all play different roles, including ourselves. So when we get into conscious leadership, it's a pretty complex and a very integrated approach. But don't worry, that's why I'm giving you the equations and the acronyms so you can walk away from this talk and actually begin to implement some of the things that you learn. Now, in integrative development, there's one thing that I do want to make sure I position so that you all understand this, because it's going to be the core of our next slides. We use something called an I-beam. So this is your second acronym. We've got your equation, C equals A to the third power. Your first acronym that I'm going to give you, which is your second takeaway, I want you to just write down on a piece of paper with a little I, and then capital B, capital A, capital B, capital E, capital A, capital M. So it's the I-beam model. This whole person approach is really important to understand, because how people develop is not linear. And this is a model that takes us beyond coaching and beyond consulting in a linear, I have a problem, I need you to solve it capacity. And the approach that comes in with the I-beam model allows individuals to understand all of these 5 components make up who you are. And if you're wondering, well, what does I-beam stand for? The next image that I have is a beautiful Venn diagram. And this is exactly how we work as human beings. Our identity as leaders is in the middle of this diagram. And our identity is made of our behavior, our environment, our aspiration, and our mindset. And so when we start talking about cultivating leadership skills, it's important to remember, and again, this is in the integrative development practice and theories, that when a client comes in and says they have a problem, well, the problem might reside in one of these 4 areas. And that little I, your identity, it's actually supposed to be a lowercase I, so that you don't have a grandiose sense of self. So we want to have a right-sized sense of self. As leaders, it's all about me, I, capital I. We want to have an ability to understand, yes, I am a leader and I matter here. I'm also leading and working with people who are just as diverse as I am. They operate in different skills from a behavior point of view. They have environments that they're in. They have aspirations. And if you notice on this image, aspiration is an arrow that's drawn outside of this Venn diagram that literally lives in the unknown. When we have aspirations, we don't know where we're going. It's an aspiration. And then when we talk about mindset, everyone's mindset is unique. So in order to get into this idea of talking about justice and equity and diversity and inclusion, I wanted to give you some context and some lead up to really understand how our identities are created. And it's really important to know that there are multiple pieces that make up our identity as leaders. So if a leader comes into me and says, one of my employees needs a new skill set, needs to learn this way of operating in project management. Well, then you could bring a solution in and teach a new skill to give that client or that team member the behavior they need. However, if you think the problem is in their behavior, but then they need some work in their mindset or to be in the right environment in order for that solution to come about, what happens in integrative development is we look at all parts of the person. We don't just focus on one. And that's a very limited way of coaching and consulting in our world, where what I say is a lot of people are operating their businesses and their lives, they're asleep. They're not looking at multiple areas of their identity. They honestly, and I lived this, think that their ego is their identity. And actually in conscious leadership, we learn that we right-size our ego. We need our ego, but our ego is not all, and it's not who we are as we operate and lead in our business. And so when we get into that, there's a little bit more information on this I-beam here. You know, if you're going to work in this area of looking at 5 areas and you work with someone who teaches these, you actually don't do the same thing in all 5 areas. Meaning coaching isn't just a if this, then that conversation, or same like consulting. It's not just I have a problem, you need to solve it. In this area, your identity, when people want to work on identity, they usually hire a mentor. When people want to improve their behavior, they'll go take training. When people are looking at the environment that they're in, they'll bring a consultant into their workspace to maybe increase culture or put up motivational signs or help the flow of the layout of the actual space. And then when it comes to aspiration, this is where coaching usually comes in. You're asking someone to help you go somewhere you've never been before. And I think it's really important here to remember, you can't take somebody somewhere in life they first haven't gone in their own mind. And if that's the first time you've heard this, I know the first time I heard that it was pretty heavy. I thought, whoa, wait a minute. When you're working with someone that is taking you into the unknown, this beautiful boat that you're in, this crystal clear blue water, as we kind of work through this talk together, you need someone who can say, I've been there. And coaches who haven't been there, they can't give what they don't possess. So you want to work with someone who you can say, hey, have you ever been there before? Do you know what it's like? And then lastly, mindset is usually where we bring in counseling. And so we're moving into an age of leadership development where we are looking for practitioners who can offer all of these. And what I love, and we're not going to get into all of the words that are listed here on this slide, but I've listed out in those 5 areas of mentor, training, consulting, coaching, and counseling, all the different areas and credentials and certifications that I have. And sometimes that's why I like to just say I wake people up. It's a lot easier than listing 10 certifications and multiple degrees. And yes, I might know a lot, but I learn how to weave in and out in my teachings and my clients in different areas so that I can adapt to the needs of that Venn diagram for clients. And that's exactly what we're going to do in this talk today. So I wanted to give you some background on that. It's really important to me that you understand that context, because this is a little bit different than just bringing a quote unquote coach or a consultant in to speak today and teach about this whole JEDI acronym and movement. So let's talk about JEDI mastery. What exactly is JEDI mastery? Maybe some of you have heard this term before. It was actually coined by Tiffany Jana, and it stands for justice, equity, diversity, and inclusion. You could also put equality in there if you wanted to. And when I think of JEDI mastery, the first time I heard Tiffany Jana's research, I thought about Luke Skywalker and Yoda. I was 5 years old when Star Wars came out. Actually, my name is Yedda, so I was actually teased and taunted and called Yoda when I was little at school. I went home crying. They said I'm little and I have, pointy green ears and I look like an old man. And the funny thing is my middle name is also Leah. So then there was the Princess Leia. But I put this image in here for you all of Luke Skywalker and Yoda for a reason. This represents, and Star Wars represents, what we know as the hero's journey. For us as women, it's the heroine's journey. Joseph Campbell did an enormous amount of research on this in his entire career. Everything in our life is a hero or a heroine's journey. Even your own leadership development and your development to becoming a conscious leader. That equation, that I-beam model, it all has actually plays into and comes about in your own journey. Every single movie that's out there, and this was what Joseph Campbell's research was on, he actually said is about that journey. The hero or the heroine leaves home, leaves things behind to then go find and acquire something outside of, which then eventually is inside of themselves and returns back to their community, and the community benefits and has value from that journey. We're all on this journey as leaders. And so as we go through this, when I started thinking about Tiffany Jana and her acronym of JEDI Mastery, I wanted to give us this visual to remind ourselves, today when we talk about this, you're not going outside of yourself to seek somebody like a Yoda to give you the answers. You're going to learn a little bit about how to also go within yourself and tap into that force that's inside of you as a leader. You already have everything that you need. There isn't anything that you're missing. If we can get you to start to hold that belief as a leader, what would change in your business? If you walked in and thought, I have everything I need, I am enough, and so are my employees and teammates and members and community members and colleagues. It would be a radical game changer. So this acronym of the justice, equality, diversity, and inclusion here on the slide, I've actually listed the goal is to achieve justice, equality, diversity, and inclusion in our workplace and in our leadership. And then I've listed it alongside of that I-beam model. Our identity is our behavior, our environment, our aspiration, and our mindset. Now, remember I said for today, learning requires curiosity. Unlearning requires courage. If you look at this and you decide that the way that this information plays out might need to be adjusted for you, or you have questions about it, it's just a theory and it's lined up in this manner to begin to introduce this information to you. But what I want you to know is maybe you unlearn something to learn something new, or maybe you're learning something new here so that you could unlearn an old way of being. So let's just keep ourselves in our boat. And as we go through these next slides and these next little bits of information about Jedi mastery and the ego and mindfulness, maybe you'll arrive at something that might actually be different than what you thought it was. So when we look at this, the Jedi mastery, justice, equality, diversity, and inclusion, I would actually say if we were all in a room together and I asked each of you to define each one of these, your definition is going to look a little bit different. So it's wonderful that we've gotten to a place in our world and in our leadership where the goal is, and we are talking about that much more openly. How do we have justice for all? How do we have equality? How do we have diversity? How do we have inclusion? And typically, in these talks, we will actually put a lot of statistics and talk about what we don't have. I actually want to take us in a different direction. If this is the goal for us to have Jedi mastery, we first need to talk about and understand how people make meaning. Because as I said, your definition might be a little bit different than my definition. And why is that? Because we actually operate in our brain on something called the ladder of inference. And yes, this is in my book. So not only do you have the slides, but you'll have resources to this. This is one whole chapter is based upon this whole meaning making in my book. I always thought it was just fascinating how we could all walk into the same room and actually behave in very different ways. And so this ladder of inference, when we walk into a room and we have this pool of available data, there's millions of bits of data that we all have access to. However, did you know out of the millions of bits of data that you have right here in this moment, your brain only picks 30, maybe 40 bits of information to actually use on a conscious level. So right there, we already have the beginnings of unconscious bias. I don't see what you see. My brain is already filtering out things and only putting attention on 30 or 40 things consciously. So while some of us might have some similar items in our 30 to 40, did you know there's a 1 in 34 million chance that somebody actually shows up and makes meaning the exact same way as you do? So I don't know about you, but I haven't met 34 million people, and maybe one day I'll meet somebody that's very similar to my meaning making, but it's practically impossible. And I want you all to understand this model. It's another simple way of understanding how people climb this ladder. This is the ladder of inference, but it's really about meaning making. So once I've seen all this data in a room, I can then go in and I pick 30 or 40 bits of data. I then make an assumption based upon the data that I've taken in. I draw a conclusion. That conclusion not only builds a belief system inside of me, but that belief is what then propels me into action. And when I say we climb a ladder, this is not a long, arduous process. Your brain does this in a matter of milliseconds. And the more you do this and the more habitual pattern it walks into the same place and sees the same thing and does the same thing, it builds what's called a reflexive loop, which means our beliefs that get built as we climb this ladder actually affect the data we select next time. So the brain loves habits and it loves patterns and it loves this ladder of inference because it requires less energy. But when we're in this reflexive loop, we're actually asleep. We're in a trance. We're not awake. We're running on old script because we've walked into the same situation or the same room so many times and over and over and over again, we've just stopped seeing certain things. And I think this is a really important piece in the unconscious bias conversation is we have to wake up so we can begin to see what other data is available to us. And if you're wondering, well, how do we do that, Yedda? Don't worry, I'm coming back to that. We'll get there. This is important, though, because if we look at that JEDI, the justice, the equality, and the diversity and the inclusion, I might walk in a room and have my idea of what justice looks like, and I pick out 30 different bits of data than you do. I would walk into a room, equality would have the same process for me. So would diversity, so would inclusion. So the question I started asking myself from a conscious leadership point of view as I started to do this work for myself and then went deep into the dive to write my book and acquire all these certifications and degrees was to really understand what prevents us from truly having a common ground to define justice, equality, diversity, and inclusion. Now, you've heard a little bit about the meaning making. So that's one way that we have a barrier that we need to overcome. Now, I can't get you to make new meaning making, and you can't get me to make new meaning making, because we've spent 40, 50, however many years we've been on this planet building these reflexive loops and these patterns and habits and patterns. So I don't want you to get rid of all of them. If you got rid of all your belief systems, you would just be a blob on the floor. What I want you to do as a conscious leader, or someone who aspires to become a conscious leader, I want you to start to think about, we have an ego. And sometimes in leadership development, the ego gets a bad rap. And people are like, oh, my ego's so bad and it made me do it. And the ego, there's even a book about it, the ego's the enemy. And I tell people, actually in conscious development, the ego's not the enemy. The ego was actually created and actually allowed to be created as a method to actually, and a means to protect you. In a small wounded state, and I wish we had time to get into it today, but I assure you in my book and in all my podcast episodes, you can listen to this. The ego is born out of our wounding. What happens though is the ego's job, in order to protect you, it creates separation. And how does it create separation? It creates judgment. It begins to judge others. If you don't look like me, act like me, if I don't think you're a safe person, I'm going to actually push you further away from me. So judgment is actually a means of separation. It creates expectations. I really should have this. This person really should do this for me. And what happens in expectation is we create separation. I mean, honestly, how many times have you set up an exact expectation of how things were going to go and had that met? I don't know about you, but it's pretty rarely for me. And then the next thing the ego does is it actually operates from a place of disdainment. It says, if I don't understand you, if you don't look like me, talk like me, think like me, operate like me, I can't like something that I don't relate to. So it then begins to say, I'm better than you, I don't like you, and that's another method of separation. And then lastly, the JEDI acronym on the ego is the capital I. So in the I-beam model, we talked about the little I, and that's a right size sense of ego. You're never going to get rid of your ego as a leader, and you're not supposed to. He or she is the one that gets up in the morning, brushes your teeth, puts on a nice top, gets dressed, and goes out into the world and has an ability to present itself in a physical form. It's also what keeps you from stepping out in the middle of the street and getting hit by a bus. It picks the fork up to feed you. Your ego has a lot of great benefit and value. So the work in this JEDI acronym is to sit down and ask yourself, where does judgment show up for me as a leader? Where do I create expectation? Where and how does disdainment show up? And when do I have such a strong sense of I that I actually exclude and leave out others? Now, don't worry, I'm going to give you the answer because there's one more column to go. We're not going to get rid of the ego, but we're going to ask the ego, instead of creating separation, can it actually work with you and your highest self as a leader to create what I would actually say is connection, which is our last column. And in order for us to talk about creating connection, and I have a couple of images here about the ego, I do want to acknowledge and honor that we're living in an unprecedented time in the world. The ego can work to our benefit. And as we see from some of these photos, several of these are taken right here in Richmond, Virginia, the city that I am from and live in, and literally witnessed and watched this unfold before my eyes. The ego can, because this is important, I think I want you all to hear this as leaders, the ego can create protection as a means to create connection. So our riots, our breakdowns, our systems, our structures that have literally been questioned, Civil War statues, processes, police, brutality, all of the things, public health, all the things we've been living in the past 2 years. The ego showed up and said, enough is enough. And we're not here to talk about, do you think the ego did the right thing or wrong thing in its display? But the ego stood up and said, we've got to break down the barriers and systems so that we can rebuild all the way from the bottom. So we do have value to have an ego as a leader. And I really want you all to hear that. We're not trying to beat it down and get rid of it. We're trying to get it to work with us, not against us. we're also able to use the ego to create connection. And that's what these pictures of the crowds and the peaceful protest, and even sometimes some of the more engaged protest, it was a desperate cry for people to say, we've had enough and we want something different. But the next level of work that we need to do as leaders is to cultivate something that I call mindfulness. And mindfulness isn't just a buzzword that's floating around out there. I actually define mindfulness as showing up and paying attention on purpose with kindness. And really, if we could cultivate mindfulness, it helps us to right-size our ego, which helps us to accomplish the goal to be a real Jedi master, which then allows us to have an identity to operate from, to create behaviors, environments, and aspirations that incorporate the Jedi across all of those platforms. And so the last Jedi acronym that I want to move into with mindfulness is, not only do we want to go from judgment to non-judgment, I would actually say the real J here is mindfulness helps us to cultivate joy. And if we don't have joy as leaders, and I'm talking about joy as human beings, I'm not talking about the conditional joy. I love my house. I love my life. I love my spouse. I love my car. I love my clothes. That's all conditional joy. Mindfulness, and this is why the title of my book is Shut Up and Sit, is inviting us to shut up and sit down and go within ourselves and say, where is the joy inside of me simply because I exist? Where is the joy inside of me because I am connected to the divine and the dignity of all intelligence and the intelligence that operates our entire world? And as leaders, if we could cultivate this sense of joy and go within, our outer world, our businesses, are a direct reflection of our inner world. So if I walked into any of your offices, or when this happens when clients call me for the first time and they want to work with me, all I have to do is just ask some questions and take a look around. And if you say my business is out of control, my bottom line is a wreck, nobody listens to me, and you're in this victim mindset, my very first invitation to the client is, let's actually just turn all that noise off. And I do use the language, we need to shut up and sit down and go within, not as punishment, but as permission for you to begin to get connected back to you. Joy is really you, your ego, being directly connected to the divine dignity of who you really are inside of yourself at the deepest level. So if we can cultivate joy, then what happens is we naturally are non-judgmental, which allows us to operate in a truly just manner as leaders and as community members and people in the world. And then we have the next one is equanimity. If you've never heard equanimity before, it's a big word. What it means is I don't react. I'm able to be calm, cool, collect, and respond no matter what's happening in and around me. And when we operate from a place of equanimity, we have a little bit of freedom between our thoughts to pause and to actually say, where am I? What is happening? What does need to happen? So imagine leading from this core sense of joy with a very responsive, spacious way to pause in your own inner narrative and the outer world. And then that allows you, for our next letter, to be able to discern. And discernment is just wisdom. When I can pause, be connected to the truth of who I really am, and know that that's the same truth of who you really are, I'm actually able to operate and tap into wisdom and discern and make very wise decisions, which ultimately allows me to be a very kind and compassionate leader. And then, of course, that leads us into our last, the I that says invitation. And so the power of invitation, when I don't feel threatened, when I feel that I am heard, seen, and valued in my own being, I can then offer that to others and invite them into a place of being heard, seen, and valued and included. And so ultimately with mindfulness, just to remind you, it's showing up, paying attention on purpose with kindness. But if we cultivate joy, equanimity, discernment, and invitation through there's tons of different modalities of mindfulness. And really mindfulness is just cultivated by being present. If we just show up and we become radically present with the power of this moment, everything else can work through us and with us and for us. And that's really the invitation that I have here for you all as conscious leaders, is to spend some time cultivating that Jedi And then what happens is it helps to right size the Jedi of the ego, which then allows you to ultimately achieve the goal of the Jedi that we all want, which is justice, equality, diversity, and inclusion. And so as we begin to bring our slide deck here and our talk to a little bit of close, I do have 2 slides that are next, and you can have a moment to do this as a reflection during this talk. I'd like to invite, though, that you take these questions and you really sit with them. Again, my language, just tell your ego, you've got to shut up and sit down and work with me. We need to come together on this one. So in my book, there's 4 components of being human. And it's really, really important to understand the first 2 are biological and the second 2 are behavioral. So if we're going to create a world of justice and equality and diversity and inclusion, and we're going to cultivate this mindfulness to right size our ego, we have to get real with ourselves and we have to understand these 4 components of being human. Remember that 1 in 34 million? These are unique to all of us. So my first question I have here is making a list of everything you know about your brain and your nervous system. I do this with all my clients. Think about the things that you use and that you like for self-regulation, your capacity for learning, your capacity for awareness, for self-protection, however your brain shows up. You might be somebody that loves visual. Maybe you love writing or reading, but you have a biological aspect to how your brain works that is so uniquely different than anybody else's. Yes, we might all have the same brain parts, but they work very differently for all of us. And different parts are overactive, underactive, patterns are wired together, pathways are created in our brain. So expecting someone to walk in and have the same biological processes and have their brain work exactly like yours is actually an ego technique and tactic to prevent and actually create separation. So this is a great homework assignment for you to get really curious. How does your brain work? Have you ever sat down and asked yourself, how does my brain work? And then secondly, make a list of everything you know about your genetics. We're all genetically different, unless you've got a twin that's identical to you on a genetic level, which is very rare. We're all really genetically unique and diverse. And so why I ask you to think about listing these out for yourself is once you do it for yourself, you'll start to actually awaken to who you are. And then what happens is you'll start to cultivate awareness that you'll start to think about these questions for others. Well, how does so-and-so's brain work in my family or at my workplace? And I'm not saying you've got to get into a long conversation with them, but if you know your brain works very differently, maybe before you jump to judgment, you actually cultivate the joy to say, hey, this is how my brain works and how I take in information. Maybe if it doesn't work that way for you, could you tell me how you'd like to learn and take in information? And that then brings joy to that person. So these 2 questions are really powerful. I love them. And then we have 2 more questions on the behavioral side. This behavioral piece is really fascinating. So again, we probably need a 2-hour lecture to really get into all of this, but this is the last 2 questions. And on the behavioral side, it's making a list of everything you know about your family of origin and your experiential conditioning. And what does that mean? Well, did you grow up with a mom and dad? Did you grow up with 2 moms, 1 dad, 1 mom, 2 moms? What was your nuclear family like? Did you have siblings? Did you have pets? What birth order are you in? This also is a very unique story making and meaning making for you as an individual and as a leader, and also for the people that are working with you. And then secondly, from a societal norm, where did you grow up? I grew up in Richmond, Virginia, known as the capital of the South, on the East Coast of the United States in the 70s when I was born. But there are people out there that you might work with and interact with that were born in Morocco. Maybe they're Muslim. Maybe their culture is very, very different. And so these 4 components and questions are great for you to start to dig in and start to ask yourself, who am I? And the truth is, do we really know who we all are? And I would say most of us don't. And so in this space of learning who you are, you can learn how to actually ask questions and invite others to tell you who they are. And so this is a lot of information, and I would love for us to have an enormous amount of time to dig into this. And this is where my coaching and consulting and book and other resources help you, because we're just beginning to introduce this concept today. And so with these 4 questions, what I want to just offer you is it is possible for you to live and lead as a Jedi Master. And if you're wondering how I know that's possible, I have a picture here of a tribe, and I want to end us with a very brief Jedi story and example. And I have a wonderful book here, Mindful of Race by Ruth King. I love her work. And I have a last slide where we'll put some references and resources for you all to dig in a little bit further on this. But in her book, she shares a story. And when we talk about what it would really look like to live in a world that provides justice, equality, diversity, and inclusion, this is what she shares. She says, there is a tribe in South Africa, and she says, when a person acts irresponsibly or unjustly, he or she is placed in the center of the village, alone and unfettered. All work ceases, and every man, woman, and child in the village gathers in a large circle around the accused individual. Then each person in the tribe, regardless of age, begins to talk out loud to the accused, one at a time. But what they talk about is all the good things the person has done. And in the center of circle, they sit there and they listen to all these things they've done in their lifetime that are good. Every incident, every experience that can be recalled with any detail and accuracy is recounted. All their positive attributes, good deeds, strengths, and kindness are recited carefully and at length. No one is permitted to fabricate, exaggerate, or be fictitious about the accomplishments or the positive aspects of this person's personality. The trial ceremony often lasts several days and does not cease until everyone is drained of every positive comment he or she can muster about the person in question. At the end, the tribal circle is broken, a joyous celebration takes place, and the person symbolically and literally is welcomed back into the tribe. And so, as we close, I'd like to actually ask you, in this beautiful boat you've been just floating around in this crystal clear blue water and listening to this talk, I want you to close your eyes and just take a moment to reflect. Imagine how it would feel to have your wrongdoings responded to in this wise way. Imagine sitting in the center of that circle and hearing only good things about you for hours and hours, maybe even days. What effect does it have on your heart, body, and mind as you imagine listening to all of the things people love about you? And just take a few deep breaths in and out and linger with this felt sense. And now imagine, how would it feel to partake in such a ceremony as a leader? Imagining someone that has been harmful or hurtful or has done something that you weren't expecting for them to do. And you actually invite them to the center of the circle. Imagine remembering with all of your heart the goodness that you can recall about this person. Maybe all you can recall is that they're someone else's child. At some time, at some point, a mother and father held this person as an infant and loved them unconditionally. And again, as you sit with this reflection, can you feel in your body, your heart, and your mind, and in all parts of your being, what it would feel like to lead from this place of Jedi mastery? Because the truth is, that's what we're all looking for, to be seen, to be valued, to be heard. But we can't give that to others unless we cultivate the ability to give it to ourselves first. And so the last slide I have here is literally, it's my tagline on my website, but it's a very Eastern philosophy tagline that says, no mud, no lotus. And what that means is sometimes we have to sit in the darkness. We're planted in the deep, dark soil of our own suffering. But if we can sit with it and we can wake up and we can cultivate the joy, we can cultivate the equanimity, the discernment, and the invitation, what happens from that seed of suffering is, as you see in this image, we begin to sprout and grow. And as we grow, the truth of who we are, it comes up above the water and it blossoms as a beautiful lotus bloom. So this is an ancient Eastern philosophy and metaphor that says this is what we're all able to do as conscious leaders. And so if you want to learn more about how to do this, we've got some resources here. And again, you'll get this slide deck, so you'll be able to download it and find these other resources. But I have some resources, and Tiffany, Jana, and Ruth King, and the other people I have referenced in this talk are also available for you to continue to grow and learn. So I want to thank you all for giving me the opportunity to be here to speak to you, to share this content with you. And there's so many more things that we can talk about, but I'm going to go ahead and just wrap this talk up. And again, thank you from the bottom of my heart.